Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of Indigenous peoples' rights in 2018.
Yeah.
And you've shared some excerpts from the Indigenous World 2019 report.
Hmm.
And honestly, getting a glimpse into these diverse stories from across the globe, it's
Yeah.
it's eye-opening, to say the least.
It really is. I think the sheer scope of this report is really impressive. You see legal victories happening right alongside, heartbreaking accounts of violence.
Yeah.
There are complex land rights issues, and they're all tangled up with these fights for cultural recognition.
Right.
It really paints a picture of how interconnected all of these issues are, no matter where in the world you look.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Right.
We'll explore some of the big themes that kind of pop up throughout these stories
Okay.
and see how they connect to the bigger picture.
Sounds good.
One thing that really jumps out at me is this constant tension surrounding land rights and extractive industries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Many indigenous communities find themselves kind of on the front lines, right? Defending their ancestral territories against things like mining, logging, and just these massive development projects.
Like the story of Berta Cáceres in Honduras.
Yes.
She was tragically murdered in 2016 for opposing the Agua Zarca Dam.
Right.
It's a stark reminder of the risks Indigenous activists face when they stand up for their land and for their rights.
Absolutely. And I think this case really brings up this important concept of free, prior, and informed consent,
Right.
or FPIC.
Yeah.
This means that indigenous communities have the right to give or withhold consent to projects that affect their lands and their lives.
Right.
And sadly, as we see with Berta Cáceres, this right is not always respected.
Yeah.
And the report has other examples, too.
Yeah, the report also talks about these conflicts in the Philippines over hydropower projects where activists are putting themselves in danger to protect their land.
Yeah,
And then there's Guatemala.
right.
In 2018 alone, over 20 indigenous leaders were murdered, often for defending their land against mining companies.
Yes, you can really see how this pattern repeats itself all over the world, even when the specific projects are different. The core issues are very, very similar.
Right.
It raises a really crucial question. How can we balance development with respecting indigenous rights and well-being?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And speaking of tough questions, the report also highlights this gap between legal frameworks
Oh, yeah.
and what actually happens on the ground.
Exactly. The report shows just how important legal frameworks are for protecting indigenous rights.
Right.
But it also reveals this frustrating implementation gap.
Yes.
Countries might have laws that look good on paper, but often they aren't being translated into real change for indigenous communities.
It's almost like having a beautifully written recipe,
Okay.
but never actually cooking the dish.
Right.
Like, what's the point if it just sits there on the page?
That's a great analogy, and
Yeah.
it makes you realize how crucial it is to have strong enforcement,
Right.
political will, and most importantly, the power for indigenous communities to hold their governments accountable.
Right. It's not enough to just have laws. They need to be put into action
Yes.
in a way that truly protects these rights.
Exactly.
Speaking of rights,
Yeah.
the report goes beyond just land and talks about this right to cultural recognition and self-determination.
These are incredibly important aspects.
Yes.
Cultural identity and self-determination
Yeah.
are so closely tied to the well-being and the resilience of indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
When these rights are denied, it creates this sense of marginalization,
Right.
which unfortunately often leads to even more inequality.
The report gives the example of the Pingpu people in Taiwan.
Okay.
They're still fighting for recognition as an indigenous group,
Wow.
which means they're missing out on all these rights and protections that come with that status.
Right.
It shows how critical it is to have inclusive definitions of who is considered indigenous.
You're right. And it's not just Taiwan. The report highlights similar struggles for recognition in places like Rwanda, where the Batwa people are facing marginalization despite not being officially recognized as indigenous.
It's a reminder that acknowledging cultural identity is vital for creating a truly equitable and just world.
Yes.
But as we've seen, standing up for these rights often comes at a cost.
Right.
And this report doesn't shy away from that harsh reality.
Yeah.
There's a deeply disturbing trend throughout these stories, this growing violence against indigenous rights defenders.
It is heartbreaking, and it underscores the urgent need for international solidarity and mechanisms to protect these brave individuals. Imagine just for doing their job of advocating for indigenous rights people like Vicky Talicorpus,
Right.
The UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are being falsely accused of terrorism.
Yeah, the report details similar situations happening in Cambodia, where activists are targeted for speaking out against land grabbing, and in India, where those working on the Naga issue face harassment.
It's awful.
It really emphasizes the need for us all to be aware of these situations and support those who are risking their lives for justice.
Exactly. These aren't just abstract concepts or far-off problems.
Right.
Real people are being threatened, attacked, and even killed for defending their communities and the environment.
Right.
This brings us back to the question of how development can be carried out in a way that genuinely respects Indigenous rights.
Okay, so we've seen how these challenges are playing out in different countries and how this fight for Indigenous rights is often met with resistance and violence. But the report doesn't just focus on the struggles. It also highlights some important legal frameworks and advocacy efforts that are working to change things.
That's right. For example, in Canada, we see some progress being made with the government's commitment to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRAP.
Okay.
Yeah.
But even with commitments like that, there are still challenges.
Right.
The report specifically mentions the Wet'suwet'en people's opposition to the Coastal GasLink pipeline in Canada.
Yeah.
It shows how even with UNDRIP in place, reconciling development projects with Indigenous rights is an ongoing process.
That's exactly the kind of nuance that this report captures.
Yes.
It isn't just black and white.
Yeah.
You know, it shows how complex these issues are, and it encourages us to look beyond simple solutions.
And it's not just about large-scale projects like pipelines. The report also discusses smaller-scale developments and the impacts they have on Indigenous communities. For example, in Norway, there's controversy surrounding wind farm projects that are encroaching on the traditional lands of the Sami people, who rely on reindeer herding for their livelihood.
That's a really interesting example because it shows how even projects that are considered green can still have unintended consequences for Indigenous communities.
Right.
It reinforces the need for careful planning, consultation, and respect for traditional land use practices.
And this isn't limited to Norway. The report shows similar conflicts emerging in Sweden, where large-scale wind farms are impacting Sami reindeer herding lands there as well.
It seems like the pursuit of economic development, even in the form of renewable energy, sometimes comes at the expense of Indigenous rights and traditional ways of life.
Yeah. You've hit on a key point. Finding that balance between development goals and the protection of Indigenous cultures and livelihoods is an ongoing challenge that requires thoughtful consideration and a commitment to collaboration.
For sure.
Right. And these challenges aren't limited to specific projects or industries. They also show up in legal frameworks and policy decisions. For instance, the report talks about the Tanatina River, which flows through both Norway and Finland.
Yes. That's a fascinating case study because it involves different perspectives on fishing rights and management practices, particularly those of the Sami Parliament in Norway. They've raised concerns about the sustainability of current fishing regulations and their potential impact on Sami fishing rights, which are deeply rooted in their culture and traditions.
It highlights the complexities of managing shared resources in a way that respects the rights of Indigenous communities across borders and how finding solutions requires careful negotiation and collaboration between all the parties involved.
For sure.
It's clear from these examples that the global landscape of Indigenous rights is incredibly complex and multifaceted.
Absolutely. And I think this report does a fantastic job of capturing that complexity.
Right.
It's not about presenting simple answers, but rather giving a comprehensive and nuanced overview of the situation.
Right. And I think one of the most important takeaways for our listener is that Indigenous rights are human rights.
Yes.
They deserve to be recognized, respected, and protected. And it's up to all of us to educate ourselves, raise awareness, and support Indigenous communities in their fight for justice.
I completely agree. By understanding the challenges, celebrating the victories, and amplifying Indigenous voices, we can contribute to a more just and equitable world for all.
So we've talked a lot about the challenges and the ongoing struggles, but the report also highlights some encouraging developments in the legal arena, particularly in Canada.
Yes, it's worth noting that Canada has been increasingly incorporating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into its policies and laws. This is a significant step forward in recognizing and upholding Indigenous rights within their legal framework.
And one of the most notable examples of this is the advancement of Bill C-262. the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act
Right.
through the Canadian Parliament.
This bill is potentially groundbreaking. It could require the government to take concrete steps to implement UNDRP in Canada, addressing historical injustices and promoting self-determination for Indigenous communities.
It's definitely a sign of progress. But as with everything else we've discussed, there are still complexities and challenges to overcome.
Exactly. The report points out that even with these positive legal developments, Canada is still grappling with upholding Indigenous rights, especially when it comes to resource extraction projects
Right.
and the balance between economic development and those rights.
It'll be interesting to see how this continues to unfold.
Yeah, it will.
The report reminds us that progress isn't always linear
Right.
and that there will always be obstacles to overcome.
Yeah. Speaking of obstacles, the report also sheds light on the concerning situation in Russia.
Okay.
It seems there's a pattern of land grabbing and displacement, particularly affecting Indigenous communities in the Arctic region. This is largely driven by the expansion of oil and gas projects in the Arctic,
Okay.
which is having a detrimental effect on their livelihoods, their traditional lands, and their overall well-being.
It's really disheartening to hear that it seems like those patterns of dispossession and environmental damage that we discussed earlier
Right.
are recurring themes in this report.
You're absolutely right. And the report highlights a particularly disturbing incident involving the Bioresources Service in the Yamalnenets Autonomous Okrug.
Okay.
They confiscated fish that an Indigenous individual had prepared for the winter,
Wow.
even though he had a fishing quota.
That's just outrageous. It's like they're deliberately targeting these communities
Yeah.
and undermining their ability to sustain themselves.
Yeah, and it seems like things are only getting worse in terms of their ability to participate in decisions that directly affect them.
Right.
You're right. The report points out that in 2015, they removed Article 31 from the Land Code,
Okay.
which has significantly weakened the ability of local Indigenous authorities to have any real say in land use or decisions about land allocation for construction projects.
It's like they're deliberately silencing these communities and taking away their power to protect their lands and their way of life.
It's definitely a trend that raises serious concerns about the future of Indigenous rights in the region.
Okay, so we've seen how Indigenous rights are being challenged in Canada and Russia, and it seems like this issue of resource extraction is a common thread.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the global implications of this and whether there's a way to balance economic development with the protection of Indigenous rights and the environment.
You've hit upon a critical point. It's a question that demands serious consideration and innovative solutions if we want to create a sustainable future for all.
It seems like there's a lot to unpack here,
Yeah.
and we're just scratching the surface of this report.
We are.
It's already clear that Indigenous peoples face a complex web of challenges, and it's crucial for us to understand these issues if we want to be allies in their fight for justice and equality.
Absolutely. This deep dive is only the beginning. There's so many more stories to explore and so much we can learn from the resilience and resistance of Indigenous peoples worldwide.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play in amplifying their voices and advocating for their rights. So let's keep diving into this report and see what other insights we can uncover.
Let's do it. You know, one thing that really struck me as we were kind of delving into these cases is that the challenges faced by Indigenous communities often go beyond physical threats and land disputes.
Yeah.
It seems like there's also a struggle for recognition and understanding on like a cultural and societal level.
You're absolutely right. And this report really highlights how those struggles for cultural recognition are playing out in various parts of the world.
Yeah.
For example, the report talks about the situation in the United States,
Right.
where Indigenous communities are actively resisting pipeline projects like the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline
Right.
because they pose threats to their sacred sites and cultural heritage.
Those are prime examples of how development decisions can really clash with the cultural values and spiritual beliefs of Indigenous peoples. It's about more than just the physical impact. It's about respecting that deep connection that Indigenous communities have to their land
Right.
and the significance of those sites for their cultural identity.
It's like you said earlier, it's about more than just the physical threats.
Exactly.
And speaking of cultural identity, the report also highlights the situation of the Sinu Indigenous people in Colombia
Okay.
who are facing displacement and loss of livelihoods due to the massive Hidroituango hydroelectric project on the Cauca River.
The Hidroituango project is a stark reminder of how these large-scale development projects can have a ripple effect on Indigenous communities.
Right.
It's not just about the immediate displacement from their lands.
Right.
It's also about the disruption of their traditional practices. the loss of their cultural connection to the river,
Hmm.
and the long-term consequences for their way of life.
And it seems like these challenges aren't limited to one continent or region.
Right.
The report brings up the situation in Nicaragua's Basawas Biosphere Reserve,
Okay.
where indigenous communities are grappling with land conflicts and displacement fueled by extractive industries and land grabbing.
It's truly disheartening to see these patterns repeat themselves around the world, and it underlines the urgent need for stronger legal protections,
Yeah.
responsible development practices, and a global commitment to upholding indigenous rights.
Yeah.
It's not about halting development altogether.
Right.
It's about finding ways to ensure that development is sustainable, equitable, and respects the rights and well-being of all people,
Right.
including indigenous communities.
Speaking of legal frameworks, the report dives into a specific case in Guatemala that really highlights this struggle for implementation that we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
It involves the Xinca people
Okay.
and their fight to enforce a court ruling that was supposed to protect their land.
Yes, the Xinca people's case.
Yes.
They won a court ruling that suspended a mine because there was no consultation with their community
Right.
as required by law.
Right.
But despite this victory, they're still facing hurdles in actually getting that ruling enforced.
It really emphasizes how important it is to move beyond just having laws on the books.
Yeah.
There needs to be a real commitment to making sure those laws are translated into action.
Yes,
And that indigenous communities have the power to hold those in power accountable.
absolutely. It's about bridging that gap between legal recognition and practical implementation.
Right.
And the report highlights similar challenges in Costa Rica,
Okay.
where despite ratifying ILO Convention 169 back in 1993, indigenous communities are still fighting for their land rights and self-determination.
It seems like that implementation gap is a recurring theme,
It is.
no matter where you look.
Yeah.
But amidst all these challenges, the report also shines a light on some positive developments
Okay.
and initiatives aimed at addressing indigenous rights.
Good to hear.
For instance, in Mexico, the government has been taking steps to address indigenous rights through various legal and institutional reforms.
Oh.
They've established institutions like the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples, or NMPI,
Okay.
and the National Council of Indigenous Peoples, which are designed to promote indigenous participation and consultation in government decisions.
It sounds like a positive step towards giving indigenous communities a greater voice in decisions that affect their lives.
Yeah.
It certainly is. But of course, there are always complexities and differing perspectives.
Right.
The report notes that these efforts have been met with mixed reactions from indigenous communities, particularly regarding their concerns about self-determination and control over resources.
Right.
It highlights the need for ongoing dialogue and a genuine commitment to addressing the root causes of historical injustices.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always linear,
Yeah,
and that it's important to listen to the diverse perspectives within indigenous communities.
exactly. It's about finding solutions that are truly inclusive and empowering.
Right. And this need for inclusivity and recognition extends beyond just policy and legal frameworks. It also plays out in the realm of cultural identity and historical narratives.
Right.
And speaking of cultural identity, the report also sheds light on the situation in Argentina,
Okay.
where the Mapuche people are facing a similar struggle to assert their land rights and cultural identity amidst pressure from extractive industries.
The Mapuche people's struggle in Argentina highlights the ongoing tensions between economic development and the protection of indigenous rights and cultural heritage.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue that requires a balanced approach that respects both the need for economic growth and the fundamental rights of indigenous communities.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that these aren't just abstract political or legal battles.
Yeah.
They have real-world consequences for the lives and well-being of indigenous peoples.
Right?
Their cultures, traditions, and very existence are at stake.
You're right. It's about human dignity and the right to live in a way that honors their heritage and sustains their communities.
Switching gears a bit, the report also delves into the political landscape in Bolivia under President Evo Morales,
Right.
who, as you know, is the first indigenous president of Bolivia.
It's a significant milestone.
Yeah.
And the report does acknowledge the advancements that have been made in terms of indigenous representation and recognition under his leadership. However, it also points to some concerns about the government's development policies
Okay.
and their potential impact on indigenous lands and resources.
It sounds like even with an indigenous leader at the helm, this tension between development and indigenous rights persists.
That seems to be the case. The report specifically highlights the government's promotion of extractive industries in indigenous territories. This has sparked a lot of debate and opposition from indigenous communities who are worried about the environmental consequences
Right.
and whether their right to free, prior, and informed consent is truly being respected.
It seems like this ongoing struggle for indigenous rights is as much about internal politics and policies as it is about external pressures from corporations and global markets.
Absolutely, and it's about finding ways to balance economic development with environmental sustainability and the protection of indigenous cultures and livelihoods. It's a complex equation with no easy answers.
Shifting our focus to Brazil, the report paints a rather bleak picture.
Right.
It seems indigenous communities are facing increasing pressure from the government and agribusiness interests, putting their land rights and cultural survival at risk.
It's deeply concerning. The report discusses the challenges faced by FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, which is responsible for protecting indigenous lands and ensuring the demarcation of their territories.
Okay.
Unfortunately, FUNAI has been facing budget cuts and political pressure, which has weakened its ability to effectively carry out its mandate.
So it's almost as if the very institutions meant to protect them are being dismantled.
Yeah.
Or undermined.
That's a valid point, and to make matters worse, the report highlights some alarming rhetoric coming from government officials and agribusiness leaders.
Right.
Rhetoric that downplays the rights of indigenous communities and justifies the exploitation of their lands.
That's really troubling. It seems like the fight for indigenous rights is becoming increasingly difficult in a climate where those in power are actively working against their interests.
It's certainly an uphill battle, and it's a reminder that legal frameworks and institutional support are essential,
Right.
but they're not enough on their own.
Yeah.
There needs to be a fundamental shift in attitudes and a recognition of the inherent rights and dignity of indigenous peoples.
Well said. And speaking of ongoing struggles for recognition, the report also brings us to Chile,
Okay.
where the Mapuche, the largest indigenous group in the country, are still fighting for their rights and facing significant obstacles.
The Mapuche people have a long history of resistance and resilience in Chile. They've been fighting for recognition of their ancestral lands, cultural rights, and self-determination for centuries. But despite some progress, they still face discrimination, marginalization, and challenges in asserting their rights.
It seems like that pattern of historical injustice continues to cast a long shadow over the present, making it even more difficult for indigenous communities to gain equality and break free from this cycle of oppression.
You're right, and the report highlights a particularly concerning trend in Chile.
Okay.
The use of anti-terrorism legislation to target and criminalize Mapuche activists who are simply defending their land and rights. It's a tactic that's been used in other countries as well to silence dissent and suppress legitimate claims.
It's a sobering reminder that even in countries where indigenous rights are acknowledged in some form, there's still a long way to go in terms of ensuring their safety, security, and full participation in society.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to remain vigilant and continue to support indigenous communities in their fight for justice and recognition. Their struggles are our struggles, and their victories are victories for all of us who believe in a more just and equitable world.
Moving on, the report takes us to Colombia, where the situation of indigenous communities is once again in the spotlight.
Yes. The report delves into the complexities of indigenous rights in Colombia, particularly the implementation of free, prior, and informed consultations, which are supposed to ensure indigenous participation in decisions that directly impact their lives and territories.
Okay.
It's about recognizing their right to self-determination and ensuring that development projects don't come at the expense of their well-being and cultural heritage.
It sounds like a step in the right direction, but as we've seen in other cases, there's often a gap between policy and practice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The report acknowledges that while Colombia has made some progress in implementing these consultations, there are still challenges in ensuring that they're truly meaningful, culturally appropriate, and actually lead to outcomes that respect indigenous rights.
It seems like there's a constant need for vigilance and a push for accountability to make sure these policies translate into tangible improvements on the ground.
Absolutely.
It can't just be lip service. It needs to be real action.
Well said. And speaking of taking action, the report also highlights the situation in Ecuador,
Okay.
where indigenous organizations have been at the forefront of advocating for their rights and interests.
That's really inspiring. It sounds like they're not just passively accepting these policies,
Hmm.
but are actively engaging in the political process and pushing for change.
Absolutely. They've been raising concerns about the government's economic
Yeah.
policies,
Yeah.
particularly those that prioritize economic growth and engagement with institutions like the IMF.
Right.
They're worried about the potential negative impact on indigenous livelihoods, environments, and self-determination.
Right.
It's about ensuring that economic progress doesn't come at the expense of their fundamental rights and the well-being of their communities.
It's a powerful reminder that indigenous communities have agency
Yeah.
and are actively working to shape their own destinies.
Exactly. And this agency is also evident in French Guiana, where indigenous youth are stepping up to advocate for their rights.
Okay.
They're particularly concerned about the proposed Montando gold mining project and other development initiatives that threaten their territories.
That's fantastic. It's encouraging to see younger generations taking the lead in defending their heritage and ensuring a sustainable future for their communities.
It really shows that the fight for indigenous rights is a multi-generational struggle,
Yeah.
and that the passion and commitment to protecting their lands and cultures are being passed down to future generations.
And speaking of the importance of passing down knowledge and traditions, the report also takes us to Guyana,
Okay.
where the government has implemented the Hinterland Employment Youth Service, or HEYS,
Okay.
an initiative aimed at addressing youth unemployment in indigenous communities.
It's an interesting initiative that aims to provide training and employment opportunities for indigenous youth, with the hope of improving their livelihoods and contributing to the development of their communities. However, the report notes that the jury is still out on the program's effectiveness and long-term impact. It remains to be seen whether it will truly empower indigenous youth and address the underlying issues of poverty and marginalization.
It's a good reminder that even well-intentioned programs need to be carefully evaluated
Yeah.
and monitored to ensure they're actually achieving their goals and not perpetuating existing inequalities.
Absolutely. And it's important to center the voices and perspectives of indigenous youth themselves in these initiatives.
Right.
Their insights and experiences are crucial for developing solutions that are truly relevant and effective.
Right, and it seems like listening to those voices is even more critical in Paraguay,
Yeah.
where the report highlights some truly disturbing incidents that demonstrate this ongoing stigmatization and disrespect for indigenous cultures.
Yes. The report mentions a particularly egregious incident where a pastor destroyed indigenous ritual objects,
Wow.
claiming he was expelling demons.
It's a blatant act of intolerance and disrespect that underscores the need for greater cultural sensitivity and understanding.
Right.
It's a shocking example of the ignorance and prejudice that indigenous communities still face,
Yeah.
even in the 21st century.
You were right, and it underscores the need for ongoing education and awareness raising to challenge those harmful stereotypes and to promote respect for the diversity of cultures and beliefs.
Moving on, the report takes us to Peru,
Okay.
where we see a mix of both challenges and positive developments in the realm of indigenous rights.
Exactly. The report highlights the ongoing struggle of indigenous human rights defenders in Peru, who face threats, intimidation, and violence for their work in defending indigenous lands, resources, and cultures. It's a dangerous path they've chosen, putting their lives on the line to protect their communities and their heritage.
It's truly disheartening to hear about the risks they face simply for speaking out and advocating for their rights.
Absolutely. But amidst these challenges, there are also some glimmers of hope. The report details the efforts of indigenous communities in Peru to protect their traditional knowledge and cultural practices.
Okay.
They're pushing for the recognition of intellectual property rights over their ancestral knowledge,
Right.
which is a crucial step in safeguarding their cultural heritage from exploitation and appropriation.
That's an important point. It's not just about protecting their physical land and resources. It's also about recognizing the value and importance of their intellectual and cultural contributions.
Exactly. Indigenous knowledge is a valuable asset that deserves to be protected and respected, not exploited for commercial gain without their consent or participation.
Right. It's about recognizing that indigenous communities are not just passive recipients of development.
Yeah.
They are active agents of change innovators and knowledge holders
Right.
who have a vital role to play in shaping a sustainable and equitable future.
Well said. And this brings us to a crucial point in our discussion.
Yeah.
The issue of development itself.
Okay.
The report highlights a major debate surrounding the proposed Hidrovia Amazonica waterway project in Peru.
Yes.
a project that could have significant implications for indigenous communities and the Amazon rainforest ecosystem.
Ah, yes, the Hydrovia Amazonica. It's a controversial project
Hmm.
that has raised concerns about its potential impact on indigenous communities who
Yeah.
depend on the Amazon River and its tributaries for their livelihoods.
All right.
People are worried about displacement, environmental damage, and whether their voices are being heard in the decision-making process.
The report emphasizes the importance of conducting thorough environmental and social impact assessments before embarking on such massive projects. It's about ensuring that development is carried out in a way that minimizes harm, respects indigenous rights,
Mhm.
and prioritizes the long-term sustainability of the Amazon rainforest,
Right.
which is a vital resource for the entire planet.
It's clear that the Hydrovia Amazonica case is a microcosm of the larger dilemma
Mhm.
facing indigenous communities around the world:
It is.
how to balance economic development with the protection of their rights, cultures, and the environment upon which they depend.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And it's a dilemma that requires a nuanced and multifaceted approach that goes beyond simplistic solutions.
Moving on, the report takes us to Suriname,
Okay.
where indigenous communities are facing a different kind of challenge,
Right.
a struggle for land rights recognition,
Okay.
particularly in the wake of the Kalinia and Lacono judgment from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights.
Oh, yes, that's a landmark case that affirmed the land rights of indigenous peoples in Suriname.
Right.
But, as we've seen in other contexts, legal victories don't always translate into tangible changes on the ground.
It's a constant reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is an ongoing process,
Yeah.
and that securing legal recognition is just one step
Right.
in a much longer journey toward achieving justice and equality.
You're absolutely right. And the report highlights the fact that indigenous communities in Suriname are still facing obstacles in securing those rights,
Right.
largely because of a lack of clear legislation and the government's reluctance to fully implement the court's judgment.
It's a frustrating situation where justice seems to be delayed,
Mhm.
leaving indigenous communities in limbo as they wait for their rights to be upheld.
It is.
It sounds like a classic case of that implementation gap we've been discussing,
Yes.
where good intentions and legal pronouncements aren't enough to guarantee real change.
No, they're not.
It's a reminder that constant vigilance, advocacy, and pressure are needed to hold those in power accountable.
Absolutely. And the report also points out that there are internal divisions within the indigenous movement in Suriname, particularly when it comes to how to best advocate for land rights and engage with the government.
It's understandable that there would be different perspectives and strategies within the indigenous movement.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue, and
Right.
finding common ground and a unified approach can be challenging, especially when there's a history of mistrust and broken promises.
It's about navigating those complexities and finding ways to bridge those internal divides,
Right.
to present a united front in their struggle for justice and self-determination.
Moving on, the report takes us to Venezuela,
Okay.
where the situation for indigenous communities is particularly dire due to the country's ongoing political and economic crisis.
It's a heartbreaking situation. The report highlights how indigenous communities in Venezuela are facing a multitude of challenges, including increased poverty, food insecurity, and limited access to basic services.
It's a reminder that political and economic instability often hits the most vulnerable populations the hardest,
Yeah.
and indigenous communities are often at the forefront of those bearing the brunt of these crises.
Exactly. And the report points to the Venezuelan government's failure to protect indigenous rights and how that neglect has led to an escalation of violence and exploitation in their territories. It's a situation that demands urgent attention and a commitment to addressing the root causes of this humanitarian crisis.
And it seems like the crisis has created an opening for even more exploitation, with the report highlighting a surge in illegal mining activities in indigenous territories.
That's right. The economic crisis has driven many people to desperate measures.
Yeah.
And illegal mining has become a way for some to survive. Unfortunately, this has resulted in environmental destruction, human rights abuses, and social conflicts.
It's a tragic situation where people are forced to choose between their basic survival and the protection of their environment and cultural heritage.
It's a stark reminder that poverty and desperation can be powerful drivers of environmental degradation, and that addressing these underlying social and economic inequalities is crucial for protecting both human rights and the environment. And to make matters worse, the Venezuelan healthcare system is in a state of collapse,
Oh, wow.
leaving indigenous communities extremely vulnerable to disease outbreaks.
The report specifically mentions an outbreak of measles among the Yanomami people,
Yeah.
a tragedy that could have been prevented with proper healthcare and vaccination programs.
It's a heartbreaking example of how systemic neglect and the erosion of basic services can have devastating consequences for the health and well-being of indigenous populations.
Right.
It's a call to action for the international community to provide humanitarian assistance and to pressure the Venezuelan government to fulfill its responsibility to protect the rights and health of all its citizens, including its indigenous population.
Now, shifting gears to Australia, the report highlights a landmark legal case concerning compensation for native title extinguishment.
Okay.
It's a case that's being closely watched by Indigenous groups, governments, and industries across Australia, as it could set a precedent for addressing historical injustices and recognizing the economic and cultural value of native title.
Yes. The Timber Creek litigation is a significant case.
Yeah.
The Ngali-Wuru and Ngali peoples were awarded compensation for the loss of their native title rights
Wow.
due to government actions, and this ruling has far-reaching implications for how native title is recognized and protected in Australia.
It sounds like a victory for Indigenous land rights.
It is.
But as we've seen in other cases, translating legal victories into tangible changes on the ground can be a challenging process.
Absolutely. The report notes that it remains to be seen how the government and industries will respond to this ruling
Okay.
and whether it will lead to a meaningful shift in the way native title is handled in the future.
Huh.
It's a step in the right direction, but there's still work to be done to ensure that Indigenous people's rights to their lands and resources are fully respected.
Moving on to French Polynesia, a territory with a complex history and a unique political status.
Yeah.
The report discusses this ongoing debate over its relationship with France and its right to self-determination.
It's an interesting case because French Polynesia has been on the UN list of non-self-governing territories since 2013.
Okay.
Reflecting the ongoing discussion about its political future.
Yeah.
There are pro-independence groups advocating for full sovereignty,
Right.
while others favor maintaining ties with France while seeking greater autonomy.
It's a delicate balance between preserving their cultural identity and navigating their political relationship with France, a country that hasn't always been sensitive to the concerns and aspirations of Indigenous populations.
Right, and to complicate matters further, there's the legacy of nuclear testing in French Polynesia,
Yeah.
a dark chapter in their history that continues to cast a shadow over their present.
It's awful.
The report highlights the devastating consequences for the health of Indigenous communities and the environment. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of colonialism and the long-lasting scars it leaves on both the land and the people.
It's a story that resonates with Indigenous communities around the world, a shared experience of exploitation, and this fight for recognition and justice in the face of powerful forces that have often disregarded their rights and well-being.
Yeah, it is.
Speaking of disregarded rights, the report also brings us to Cambodia,
Okay.
where Indigenous communities are facing an uphill battle in securing their land rights and protecting their traditional livelihoods.
Cambodia is a country where economic development and land concessions have often come at the expense of Indigenous communities,
Right.
who are increasingly being pushed off their lands and deprived of their traditional sources of sustenance. It's a pattern that we've seen repeat itself throughout our deep dive into this report.
And it seems like the government's policies have often prioritized economic growth over the protection of Indigenous rights, leaving these communities vulnerable to exploitation and displacement.
Right. And the report highlights the courageous work of Indigenous activists in Cambodia, who are working tirelessly to defend their communities and environments, despite facing threats and intimidation.
Right.
They're risking their own safety and well-being to protect their ancestral lands and their way of life.
Their courage and dedication are truly inspiring.
Yeah.
A reminder that even in the face of adversity, Indigenous communities are resilient and continue to fight for their rights and their future.
Absolutely. And speaking of fighting for recognition, the report takes us to China,
Okay.
a country that doesn't officially recognize the concept of Indigenous peoples.
That's surprising considering China has a significant population of ethnic minorities who could be considered indigenous under international standards.
It's a complex situation.
Yeah.
China's approach is to provide some degree of autonomy and cultural recognition to certain minority groups.
Okay.
But they shy away from acknowledging their specific rights as Indigenous peoples as defined by international law.
It seems like there's a gap between the way Indigenous rights are understood and protected at the international level
Yeah.
and how those rights are implemented or even acknowledged within specific national contexts.
Exactly. And this discrepancy can create significant challenges for indigenous communities who are seeking to assert their rights and protect their cultures and territories.
Right.
In the case of China, the report highlights the challenges faced by Tibetan activists and other minority groups in asserting their cultural and religious rights,
Right.
which are often subject to government restrictions.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often a multifaceted struggle that involves navigating not only local and national power structures, but also global political dynamics and differing interpretations of international law.
You've hit on a crucial point. It's about understanding how global and local forces intersect and shape the experiences of indigenous communities around the world.
And speaking of navigating complex historical legacies,
Yeah.
the report takes us to Japan,
Right.
where the Ainu people, the indigenous people of Hokkaido and other northern islands, are still seeking recognition and redress for historical injustices.
The Ainu people have a long and rich cultural heritage, but they faced a long history of discrimination and assimilation policies that have eroded their language, culture, and traditional way of life.
It's yet another example of how the legacy of colonialism continues to impact indigenous communities, even in places where those colonial structures are no longer in place.
It's about acknowledging those historical injustices and finding ways to repair the damage that has been done,
Yeah.
both culturally and materially. And while Japan has taken some steps toward recognizing Ainu identity and promoting cultural revitalization, there's still a long way to go in addressing the past and ensuring full equality and participation for the Ainu people in Japanese society.
Moving on to Malaysia, the report examines the impact of the 2018 general election on indigenous rights, which brought with it a new government and hopes for positive changes.
Yes, the election of a new government in Malaysia signaled a potential shift in the political landscape and a renewed focus on addressing the concerns of indigenous communities known as Orang Sasal in Malaysia.
But as we've seen throughout this report, political promises and shifts in power don't always translate into immediate or lasting change.
Absolutely. The report acknowledges the challenges in implementing those changes and addressing the persistent discrimination and marginalization that Orang Asal communities face. It's about translating those promises into concrete policies and actions that make a real difference in the lives of indigenous peoples.
It's a reminder that political change is an ongoing process, and that holding those in power accountable is essential for ensuring that those changes are actually implemented and lead to tangible improvements.
For sure. And speaking of holding power accountable,
Right.
the report also highlights a controversy surrounding the ratification of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or ICERD,
Okay.
which faced opposition from conservative groups in Malaysia.
It's interesting how the debate over ICERD ratification in Malaysia brings to light the complex dynamics of ethnicity, religion, and politics in relation to indigenous rights. It shows how the fight for indigenous rights is often intertwined with broader social and political struggles for equality and justice.
Right, and it highlights the challenges in promoting equality and non-discrimination in multi-ethnic societies, where different groups may have competing claims and interpretations of rights. It's about finding ways to navigate those complexities and ensure that the rights of all groups are protected without undermining the rights of others. And despite those complexities, the report does highlight some positive developments in Malaysia, such as the appointment of the first Orang Asal Chief Justice, a significant step towards greater representation and inclusion in the legal system.
It's a powerful symbol of progress and a reminder that representation matters.
Yeah.
Seeing someone from their own community in a position of power can be incredibly empowering and inspiring for marginalized groups.
And it's not just about symbolic representation. The report also points to the establishment of the Ulu Muda Forest Reserve,
Okay.
a positive development in recognizing the importance of indigenous lands and traditional knowledge and environmental conservation.
It's encouraging to see concrete actions being taken to protect indigenous lands and the vital role they play in maintaining biodiversity and ecological balance.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that these achievements must be accompanied by ongoing efforts to address the systemic issues that continue to affect indigenous communities in Malaysia.
Right.
Issues like poverty, discrimination, and the lack of access to basic services.
Moving on, the report takes us to Myanmar,
Okay.
where indigenous communities are facing a different set of challenges,
Okay.
largely due to the country's long-standing internal conflicts.
Myanmar is a country where indigenous communities have long endured discrimination, marginalization, and violence, especially in regions where armed conflict has persisted. The report highlights the military's role in land-grabbing, forced displacement, and human rights abuses against indigenous peoples who are often caught in the crossfire of these conflicts.
It's tragic to see how violence and political instability can exacerbate existing inequalities and create even more suffering
Yeah,
for those who are already marginalized and vulnerable.
you're right. And the report also shines a light on the challenges faced by indigenous rights defenders in Myanmar, who are often targeted and criminalized for their work.
It's a stark reminder of the risks that activists and advocates often face
Yeah.
when they speak out against injustice and defend the rights of their communities.
They're truly courageous individuals, and the report emphasizes the need for greater international pressure on the Myanmar government
Right.
to respect human rights and to create a more inclusive and peaceful society for all its citizens, including its indigenous population.
Moving on, the report takes us to the Philippines,
Okay.
a country where indigenous communities are facing escalating violence and displacement due to militarization and the government's counterinsurgency operations.
Right.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of security and stability can sometimes come at the expense of human rights and the well-being of marginalized communities.
It's a tragic situation. The Philippines, under President Duterte, has seen a sharp increase in violence against indigenous communities.
Yeah.
With the government's war on drugs and counterinsurgency campaign leading to extrajudicial killings, forced evacuations, and the militarization of indigenous territories.
It's alarming to hear how state-sanctioned violence is being used to target indigenous communities who are often unjustly labeled as terrorists or communist rebels by the government.
It's a tactic that's been used throughout history to justify the oppression and dispossession of indigenous peoples, portraying them as enemies of the state to legitimize violence and control.
And it seems like this tactic is having a chilling effect on indigenous activism and advocacy in the Philippines.
You're right. The report details the challenges faced by indigenous activists and human rights defenders who are living in a climate of fear where speaking out against injustice can have deadly consequences. It's a situation that demands international attention and a call for the Philippine government to respect human rights, uphold the rule of law, and engage in meaningful dialogue with indigenous communities.
Moving on to Taiwan, the report highlights the ongoing struggle of indigenous peoples for full recognition and the implementation of their rights.
Yeah.
Taiwan's situation is complex because it's not a member of the United Nations and doesn't have the same international legal obligations as many other countries.
Right.
But despite this, there's a growing movement within Taiwan to recognize and protect the rights of its indigenous population.
That's good to hear.
And one of the key issues highlighted in the report is the debate over the recognition of the Pinghu people as indigenous.
Right. The Pingpu people's struggle for recognition in Taiwan exemplifies the challenges faced by indigenous groups who have been subjected to assimilation policies and historical marginalization. In their case raises important questions about the criteria used to define indigeneity and the government's responsibility to address the legacy of past injustices.
It's about acknowledging the historical complexities and ensuring that all groups who meet the criteria for indigenous status are granted the rights and protections that come with that recognition.
And it's about understanding that identity is fluid and complex, and that those definitions of indigeneity need to be flexible and inclusive to capture the diversity of experiences and historical realities of different groups.
Now moving on to Thailand, a country known for its natural beauty and cultural richness, but also for its long history of tensions between the central government and indigenous communities.
The report dives into the ongoing struggle of indigenous communities in Thailand to secure their land rights and protect their traditional livelihoods, which are often threatened by development projects, land grabbing, and the encroachment of industrial agriculture.
It seems like a recurring theme in this report, that tension between economic development and the rights of indigenous communities to maintain their traditional ways of life and their connection to their ancestral lands.
You're right, and the report highlights a particularly troubling case in Thailand, the Karen people in Kang Krachan National Park.
Okay.
They were forcibly evicted from their ancestral lands by park authorities who destroyed their homes and property in the name of conservation.
It's a shocking example of how conservation efforts can sometimes be used to justify the displacement and dispossession of indigenous communities, even those who have been living in harmony with the environment for generations.
It highlights the need for a more holistic and inclusive approach to conservation, one that recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples and acknowledges their role as stewards of the land. It's about finding ways to protect biodiversity and ecosystems while also respecting the rights and livelihoods of the communities who call those places home.
Moving on to Vietnam, where the report explores the challenges faced by ethnic minority groups, often considered indigenous, in navigating a political system that doesn't fully recognize their distinct identities and rights.
Right. Vietnam's situation is unique because the government tends to categorize all ethnic groups, other than the Kin majority, as ethnic minorities.
Okay.
But many of those groups share the characteristics and experiences of indigenous peoples as defined by international law.
It sounds like another case where national policies and definitions don't fully align with the international framework for recognizing and protecting indigenous rights.
Yeah.
It makes it harder to address their specific concerns when the government doesn't acknowledge their unique status.
You're absolutely right. And the report highlights some of those specific concerns,
Okay.
including land rights, cultural preservation, and political participation issues that are often intertwined and impact all aspects of their lives. For instance, many ethnic minority communities in Vietnam are facing land conflicts and displacement, often driven by the expansion of large-scale agricultural plantations and infrastructure projects.
It seems like those familiar patterns of development-induced displacement are recurring themes regardless of the specific geographic location.
It's a global phenomenon, and the report emphasizes the need for Vietnam to implement policies that respect the rights of ethnic minorities, including their right to free, prior, and informed consent in projects that affect their lands and resources. It's about finding ways to achieve economic development without sacrificing the rights and well-being of marginalized communities.
Well said. And speaking of marginalized communities facing an uphill battle, the report takes us to West Papua, where the struggle for self-determination and human rights is a persistent and often overlooked issue.
West Papua's situation is particularly complex because it's a territory that was annexed by Indonesia in 1969, and the Indonesian government has been accused of human rights abuses, militarization, and suppression of indigenous Papuan rights ever since.
It's a reminder that colonialism isn't just a historical phenomenon. It's an ongoing process that continues to impact the lives and destinies of indigenous communities around the world.
You're right, and in West Papua, the Indonesian government's policies have often aimed to assimilate Papuans into the Indonesian nation-state, sometimes through force and coercion. This has resulted in the suppression of their cultural language and their right to self-determination. And the report highlights the challenges faced by Papuan activists and human rights defenders who often face intimidation, arrest, and violence for speaking out against the injustices they face.
It's incredibly brave of them to continue their activism in the face of such repression. They're risking their lives to fight for their people's right to exist, to maintain their cultural identity, and to have a say in their own future.
Absolutely. Their courage is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the determination to fight for justice, even in the most challenging of circumstances.
And it's a reminder to all of us that we can't just stand by and ignore these injustices. We need to speak out, raise awareness, and hold those in power accountable.
Well said. And beyond the human rights violations, there's another layer to the West Papua situation that's often overlooked: the environmental impact of resource extraction.
You're right. West Papua is a region incredibly rich in natural resources, which has unfortunately made it a target for large-scale mining, logging, and plantation operations. The report highlights how these industries have often operated with little regard for the environment or the rights of indigenous Papuans.
So we see the same patterns of exploitation and disregard for indigenous rights playing out in a different context this time, with the environment as the victim.
It's a classic case of short-term economic gains being prioritized over long-term sustainability and the well-being of both people and the planet. It's clear that the situation in West Papua demands a more holistic approach to development, one that takes into account the interconnectedness of human rights, environmental protection, and indigenous self-determination. Speaking of interconnectedness, our deep dive into this report takes us next to Bangladesh, where indigenous peoples, particularly those in the Chittagong Hill Tracts region, are facing their own set of challenges.
The Chittagong Hill Tracts is a region with a long and complex history. Indigenous peoples there have faced discrimination, marginalization, and land dispossession for decades. The report highlights the ongoing land conflicts and displacement driven by the influx of Bengali settlers and the government's development projects.
It's like we're seeing a microcosm of the global struggle for indigenous land rights playing out in this one region: the pressure from development, the influx of outsiders, and the erosion of traditional ways of life.
You're absolutely right. And to understand the current situation, we need to look back at the history of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. It's been the site of a long-standing conflict between indigenous communities and the Bengali-dominated government, with land-grabbing, forced evictions, and the suppression of indigenous culture and language fueling tensions for years.
So there's a deep history of conflict and injustice that continues to shape the present reality for indigenous peoples in this region.
It's exactly. The 1997 peace accord was a significant step towards resolving the armed conflict. But, as the report points out, many of the underlying issues regarding land rights and indigenous self-determination remain unresolved. It's a reminder that peace agreements are just the beginning of a long process of healing and reconciliation.
And it seems like indigenous women in Bangladesh are facing a particularly heavy burden, experiencing multiple layers of discrimination based on both their gender and ethnicity.
You're right to point that out. The report highlights the challenges faced by indigenous women in Bangladesh, who are often subjected to violence, exploitation, and limited access to education and economic opportunities. Their voices and perspectives are often excluded from decision-making processes, further marginalizing them within their communities and in society as a whole.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is also a fight for gender equality and the empowerment of women.
Absolutely. Addressing those intersecting forms of discrimination is essential for creating a truly just and equitable society for all.
Now shifting our focus to India, a country with a vast and diverse indigenous population known as scheduled tribes in their legal framework.
India's situation is interesting because they have a constitutional framework that recognizes the rights of scheduled tribes and provides for affirmative action measures to address historical injustices.
It sounds like a strong legal foundation for protecting indigenous rights. But as we've seen in many other cases, legal recognition doesn't always translate into effective implementation on the ground.
You've hit the nail on the head. The report dives into the challenges faced by indigenous communities in India, highlighting issues like ongoing land alienation and displacement, often driven by development projects, mining operations, and the expansion of agriculture.
So even with those legal protections in place, indigenous communities in India are still losing their lands and resources, which are vital for their livelihoods, cultural identity, and well-being.
Exactly. And the report emphasizes the need for stronger legal protections and enforcement mechanisms to prevent further land grabbing and to ensure the restoration of lands that have already been taken.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous land rights is often a fight against powerful economic interests and a struggle to assert their right to self-determination in the face of development pressures.
And it's not just about land rights. The report also discusses the issue of human rights violations against indigenous peoples in India, including police brutality, extrajudicial killings, and the targeting of activists who are speaking out against injustice.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often a dangerous one, and that those who stand up for their communities and their lands often face threats, intimidation, and violence.
Absolutely. The report underscores the urgent need for accountability and justice for these violations, and the importance of protecting indigenous human rights defenders who are working to expose and address these issues.
Speaking of long-standing struggles, the report also examines the situation of the Naga people who have been fighting for self-determination in northeastern India for decades.
The Naga people's struggle for self-determination has been marked by conflict negotiations and ongoing demands for greater autonomy. It's a complex issue with deep historical roots, and the report highlights the challenges in finding a lasting solution that respects the rights and aspirations of the Naga people, while also addressing the concerns of the Indian government.
It's a reminder that the path to self-determination is often long and arduous, and that finding peaceful and just solutions to these complex political conflicts requires dialogue, compromise, and a willingness to understand the perspectives of all sides.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own destinies and to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives and their territories.
Wow, it's been quite a journey exploring these stories from around the world. It's clear that indigenous peoples face a complex web of challenges, but amidst those struggles, there's also incredible resilience, resistance, and a deep commitment to protecting their rights, cultures, and lands.
I completely agree. And I think the key takeaway from this deep dive is that indigenous rights are human rights. We need to continue to raise awareness, educate ourselves, and support indigenous communities in their fight for justice and self-determination. Their struggles are interconnected with the broader fight for a more just equitable and sustainable world for all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Indigenous World 2019 report, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to the report and other resources, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.